Welcome to The Interview, a Bailiwick Express podcast. I'm Matthew Leach, and this week I spoke to Deputy Lindsay de Sausmarez about her committee's recently released electricity strategy. In it, the Committee for the Environment and Infrastructure recommend that Guernsey pursues a new interconnector with France while developing solar and wind power to meet our increasing needs for electricity. She says the response to her strategy has been positive so far, but it'll now need political will to get the wheels turning. So I'm here today with Deputy Lindsay de Sausmarez, the President of the Committee for the Environment and Infrastructure. Thank you very much for coming in to see us.
Thanks for having me.
Two times in 2 days now, saw you yesterday as well for a briefing on all of this. So we're here to talk about the electricity strategy, the island's electricity strategy that has recently, the policy letter that was published by your committee. We've had some responses from Guernsey Electricity and Chamber of Commerce, kind of responses to the strategy itself. I mean, it's been a day. How do you think it's been received?
I'm feeling quite pleased, actually. It seems to have landed and been received very positively so far. Obviously, it's a very long and detailed document, and people will need time to go through it and absorb it. Look at some of the detail and get their heads around it. But so far, the people that have managed to read it have been very positive about it. Or certainly the ones that have got in touch with me to tell me anyway.
Having read through the whole thing now a couple of times, we've run some stories on it. I mean, I personally think it's a great piece of work, and I think the pathway that has been prioritised by the committee makes absolute sense in the kind of climate that we're in. I mean, how do you feel about it? Are you quite proud of the work that's been done to curate it?
Yeah, I'm particularly proud of the way in which the work was done, because it was a very iterative and consultation-led piece of work. We didn't just lock ourselves away in a room and appear, with our thoughts on a bit of paper. It was very iterative. We worked very closely with a group that we call the Energy Partnership in particular. And the Energy Partnership is a group of energy industry representatives, basically stakeholders. And so they are all experts in their field. And it's not just electricity, I should stress, it is the energy sector more generally. But of course, even, organisations that we might traditionally associate with hydrocarbons are themselves on that energy transition. So they're really important players in this. So we work very closely with the Energy Partnership. We had some really good quality subject matter expertise from Siemens and PwC in their respective fields. And when we got feedback from the Energy Partnership, from the business sector, from political colleagues, we took that feedback very seriously and responded to it. So that is how we ended up with the proposals that we've got. We also had a steering group, which was a really important part of the process, and that was ensured for quite a lot of cross-committee coverage, I suppose, if you like. We had myself and Deputy Haskins, also Deputy Leach and Deputy Mokes. So between us, we cover quite a lot of committees. And we also had Mr. Jeremy Thompson, who was for many years the chair of the Guernsey Renewable Energy team. And he was also on the steering group. So I was confident in the process because I knew that we'd left no stone unturned. And we really did start from a basis of saying, we are not going to assume anything. All suggestions are on the table, even ones that, some people might have dismissed as, really out there or silly or whatever. We left no stone unturned. We really wanted to make sure that we had considered all the options and all of the scenarios and done it properly. And we were very careful to make sure that no preconceptions on the best solutions, influenced the work.
And so we ended up, just a quick refresher, because I know everyone kind of knows this now, Pathway D is the kind of preferred option out of the ones that have been put forward. Just quickly retell us what that is.
Okay, so it is, in terms of the supply, obviously the strategy is a little bit more all-encompassing. It looks at the supply, the demand and the market structure. But in terms of the supply pathway, which is Pathway D, we are looking at a second interconnector, which is Pathway E, which would be direct to France and which would have a capacity of 100 megawatts. We'd be looking at an offshore wind component of 65 megawatts and a solar component of 10 megawatts. So those are the main, obviously all in addition to what we've already got, which is an interconnector via Guernsey, which has got a capacity of 60 megawatts. So, obviously the background context is we've got a growing population. Our lives are becoming ever more dependent on electricity. It's a very important source of energy. And so we've got growing demand. It's really important that we meet that. We've got to keep, all the equipment at the hospital running. We've got to keep data servers going, let alone the lights and the Wi-Fi and our cookers and our heating and teenagers gaming and all the rest of it. I mean, obviously, electricity is so fundamentally important to our lives and lifestyles. So it's important that we have got a secure and affordable and environmentally responsible strategy to see us through the next few decades. And so that is why we're proposing what we're proposing. But basically, Pathway D is our preferred option because it is the best blend of security and resilience of supply. It's a very flexible pathway, and it also best balances those sometimes competing objectives in terms of security, affordability and environmental impact. So it really does tick more boxes than any other, which is why it's our preferred pathway.
And so are questions about where we're going to put solar panels and how many turbines is this going to be and what kind of wind farm are we looking at? Is this too premature because this kind of stuff needs to happen next?
Absolutely. What we want the states to do is to agree a strategic direction. There is a huge amount of work that needs to happen before we can, even propose any specific ideas with the kind of detail that you're talking about. But until we've got that strategic direction, it's very difficult to do that work because technically all options are still on the table. So what you wouldn't want to do is work everything up to the nth degree, work out the best possible, proposals, which would take another however long, and then come back and go, ta-da, here you go. And someone go, oh, I just think this is fundamentally wrong. We're going the wrong way. We should have looked at this. So it's really important that we get that strategic direction agreed first, and then we've got the mandate to go and do the further, much more detailed work to come back with specific proposals later on in the process.
And so we're talking there about time frame and how things kind of slot into place. I did want to just touch base on the fact that you're hoping that this would go to debate in July. Mm-hmm. Does that feel likely? And even if it does, do you think we're going to get round to it?
Those are both very pertinent questions. I don't know the answer because anything can happen in states meetings. I do think people recognise this as a very important bit of work. I think especially, politicians are sometimes accused of living in a bit of a bubble, but I think industry has been very good at communicating how keen they are for the states to make a strategic decision because there are real world investment business decisions business decisions on significant investments that need to happen. All these energy businesses do need to know what the states thinks that direction is. And those are decisions that need to be made sooner rather than later. So I think the industry has been good at, communicating that the sooner we can set a strategic direction, the more helpful it's going to be for everyone involved. And obviously, the quicker and more efficiently, hopefully, we can achieve our various targets. So I don't know. The first challenge is when it is scheduled for business. Yeah. The states P&R will propose that. The states will agree or amend that. And then, as you allude to, even once it's on an agenda, whether or not we get to it will depend on how much debate there is on other items of business in the same states meeting. So you never can tell, but I'm ever the optimist and I'm hoping that we will.
July is set to be quite a bulky one,
yes,
I believe.
There's a lot of important stuff, yeah.
As well as the Island Games. So it's
yeah,
all kicking
I'm really
off
looking
the same
forward
week.
to the Island Games. So excited, yeah.
So the headlines that have come out of it, I suppose, have been, the potential, the easy pickings for a conversation for the public have been the potential of a wind farm off the coast of Guernsey. The costs of it sound big, but having gone through it all, I mean, these are projected costs up until 2050, and it would surprise me if a power station didn't cost that much in that period of time. Um, Speaking briefly on the cost, I mean, this is the one that's going to be relatively the cheaper version, I suppose, than sticking with the status quo.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you're right that all these numbers do sound eye-watering and terrifying simultaneously. But you're right to point out that these are costs that stretch over, the best part of 3 decades we're talking about here. And it's also the total cost. So it's not just the capital expenditure. We're talking about all the operational costs as well. And the other thing that's important to stress is that it's not just, no one should assume that these are costs that the states is going to have to fund directly. Some may well be, but others would be costs that Guernsey Electricity would pick up. And there are other ways of funding various different components. Now, decisions on how all these things are funded are decisions that would be made later on in the process when we've done that more detailed work. We've been able to analyse the different options and bring those back for the states to make an informed decision at that time. So I really would sort of warn against making any assumptions about how it's going to be paid. How it's going to be paid for. But there are some sort of general principles, I suppose, or guiding factors. One of the recommendations in the strategy is that certainly when it comes to the offshore wind component, it's recommended from a cost optimization point of view, which means best value for money, really, that the 65 megawatts is owned publicly, whether that's directly through the states or through Guernsey Electricity or through some special purpose vehicle that's set up for that, doesn't really matter. But if it is in public ownership, that is going to deliver the best value for money for Guernsey consumers. Now, it doesn't mean to say that it has to be publicly owned, because it could be funded, it could be owned by a third party, a private, a different business. And that's fine. And it may well be that that's actually the most attractive way of doing it. That would mean less expenditure for government, or less expenditure of public money in whatever form that takes. But it probably would mean higher costs for consumers, because obviously you have to factor in the profit for that other organisation, that other party. So there are some interesting options, which is why we're not recommending any specific way of doing it. We're saying, just give us the strategic direction. And once we've got that, we'll go away and do that further work and come back with a much more detailed look at how it's best to achieve it.
Because it sounds like a lot of work, a lot of infrastructure build as well, a lot of, even beyond even deciding a direction, it sounds like a lot of work. I mean, say, you would hope that your policy letter gets approved, your chosen path gets approved. How long then until a decision comes then back to the states? And then how long after that until we're actually building anything that can push towards this?
Well, look, I think the really big components, which are the second interconnector and the offshore wind component, they are really big, really long-term infrastructure projects, assuming that all those gateways are passed through and the states agrees them as and when. However, we are determined to hit the ground running. And so while those things will take time, there are some things that we would expect to be up and running much, much sooner. You'll have noticed that we've actually got some pretty short-term targets for solar PV. So our first target for solar PV is actually in 2025, which is 5 megawatts, and then 10 megawatts by 2027 or 28, sorry, I can't remember exactly, but quite soon afterwards. So that's a very rapid rollout of and very much increased on what we've got now. So there are lots of one of the sections in the policy letter deals with what we call interim measures, and that's really sort of policy speak for what do we need to do to get things up and running right now. What are the things that we need to focus on straight away to make sure that market starts working really dynamically and effectively. So although yes, there are some aspects which will take a long time and are really big and long-term infrastructure projects, there are other things that I think people will notice changing much more rapidly. So we will see not quite immediate results, but certainly short and medium-term progress.
And when we're talking about the possibility of having wind turbines, I know in the policy letter and during the briefing recently, it has been discussed this wouldn't necessarily be a solo venture from Guernsey. Why is that the case? Is that because it'd be more difficult to get somebody out here just to build one?
Well, it's a variety of reasons, really. But what the pathway recommends is the amount of offshore wind that would be optimal to meet our domestic needs. Now, in the grand scheme of things, we're a fairly small community. We don't have the same power requirements as larger regions or jurisdictions. And so, in the grand scheme of things, a 65 megawatt wind farm is pretty small on the international stage.
How big is that? How
it
is
depends
that
because
two,
there are
or
different.
is there different sizes?
So it
suppose?
depends
Yeah,
on
okay.
what size tower, and that's exactly part of the the analysis that would have to go on. But obviously, wind farms are an area of international focus at the moment because we're in this global energy transition. There's a lot of focus, quite rightly, on really upping the ante when it comes to renewable power. And so there are a lot of investors, commercial backers who are very interested in investing in offshore wind because this is the general direction of travel. It's a very important part of our response to climate change. A very important tool to help mitigate it. And so when you are looking at it through a commercial lens, it's quite possible that a larger wind farm would be much more commercially attractive than a smaller wind farm. So we've been very clear in the policy letter that we shouldn't think about the offshore wind component as a 65 megawatt wind farm. It might be, but it may well be that it makes much more commercial sense to have that as part of a much bigger and therefore more commercially attractive wind farm. But again, those decisions are going to be easier to make once we've been able to do the more detailed analysis and come back with specific proposals. But those are exactly the kind of questions that we'll be asking then.
So, of course, I do want to touch base on Guernsey electricity, clearly a key part of this entire policy letter and the conversation at hand. The proposal and the preference, I suppose, of the committee is to retain GEL as the main operator of the grid and to promote it going forwards. Do you trust our electricity provider in Guernsey to be able to push forward with these kinds of proposals?
Yeah, absolutely. We are very lucky, actually, that our electricity utility is publicly owned. You'll have seen in other jurisdictions, other places. Well, for example, France have just renationalised EDF because especially in a time when there is a lot of sort of volatility in the energy markets, and you do have to, you do have a sort of transition to make, then I think you've got more... you've got more options available to you, I think, potentially. I think we are in a strong position having our electricity utility in public ownership. So I think that's a real strength. Now, obviously, again, we're quite a small place. It wouldn't make any sense to duplicate our infrastructure assets. No. So it wouldn't make sense to have multiple grids. It's just going to introduce cost, which is going to push up prices for consumers at the end of the day. So we've always had this advice, which has been reconfirmed through this process, that we are just subscale to offer retail competition. In other words, it wouldn't make sense. It would only be to the detriment of Guernsey consumers were we to allow, multiple electricity companies to vie for customers, because we just don't have the market scale to support that and make it make sense. It works in other places because they're much bigger and the size of the market can support it. But really in Guernsey, we're too small for that. So what we're recommending is that we don't have any competition in the retail space, but we do have competition in other areas of the market. So there can be competition, which would be a very healthy and very good thing, in, for example, locally generated renewables. So they will be able to basically sell that to Guernsey Electricity, and that will feed into what we as consumers use.
And is this where regulation, I suppose, comes in again? It's been an interesting process of regulating electricity in Guernsey. We had, obviously, the GCRA has led into the SDSB, and then this policy letter proposes a kind of economic development to pursue new regulatory framework of some kind. Has there been conversations about going back to the authority that we had in the first instance?
Well, look, the regulation does actually sit with the Committee for Economic Development, so I wouldn't want to sort of second guess what their views are. But we do, one of the appendices of the policy letter is a very detailed look at the sort of regulatory environment. I think the important thing to concentrate on is what we want regulation to achieve. So we want regulation to ensure that there is fair and equal access to that energy market. We don't want other energy providers feeling as though they're at a disadvantage to, for example, Guernsey Electricity, or indeed they're at a disadvantage to any other energy providers because, there isn't the environment that gives them the confidence they do have the same sort of access and the same advantages as everyone else. So I think it's really important that whatever regulatory framework is ultimately decided enables that fair and equal access to the market. Consumer protection is also a really important one, obviously. And our strategy touches on that as well. But I think, to balance it all out a little bit, we've got to remember that the more regulation you put in, this is a little bit like the push me, pull you situation. Yeah. The more regulation you have, typically the sort of less agile your market, but also probably more pertinently for many people listening to this, the more costly it is. And those costs inevitably get passed on to consumers. So you do have to find the right balance. And I think the important thing to focus on is not how you achieve it, but, well, obviously that's what economic development will be looking at, but most importantly, what you want to achieve. And I think as long as we can create an environment in which energy providers have got equal, fair and equal access to that market, then it's doing its job.
I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, and good luck with your policy letter.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Interview, a Bailiwick Express podcast. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe. You can find us on all social media channels, and if you'd like to keep up to date on all the work the Express team does, please sign up to our daily email by visiting gsy.bailiwickexpress.com.